Hi folks, Paul Morelli here, and this is a video about muting the trumpet. This is going to have some good advice and demonstrations for both arrangers and composers and orchestrators for how and when should I use mutes, how does it affect the technique of the instrument, and also tips for trumpet players in dealing with playing the different mutes. There's plenty of challenges in playing with a mute, and I'll try to help you out. And best of all, I'm going to demonstrate them so you can hear exactly the kind of sound you get. So before we start, why don't I talk about some general characteristics of mutes. Almost every mute actually goes into the bell of the trumpet, and this means it's going to change how the trumpet plays. It's not going to respond quite as quickly. It's going to be harder to play loudly because it'll cut the volume back. It's going to throw off your highest and lowest notes, some mutes more than others, but they're all going to make it more difficult to do that. And it's going to throw your tuning off. Most mutes will make your tuning go a little bit sharp. Some flat though, so you have to know and be aware and adjust. Trumpet players, don't get cheap mutes. Get good mutes. I will show you what the brand of each of these is. Now, I'm not a paid spokesperson. I don't care what you use, but these are just good recommendations of good quality professional mutes. I think most of them cost between about 35 and 60 bucks. That may sound like a lot for a mute, but trust me, it's worth it to avoid cheap crap. Okay, one more note before I start demonstrating mutes, and that is, for you arrangers, we need time to switch out mutes. Let me demonstrate. I'm going to play a little something, and then I'll put in a mute, but you'll notice it takes a few seconds. Here we go. So that is the absolute minimum amount of time you need to switch a mute out. You'll notice it's more than just cramming it in the bell. I've got to take the instrument off my face. I've got to grab the mute, get it in there, get the instrument back up, get it set in the right place, breathe, and go. Many arrangers are very guilty of extremely quick mute changes. Now, we can make adaptations to that. If I have to, I can play with one hand, cram the mute in really quickly. There's a lot of problems with that. First of all, you risk cramming the instrument into your face and hurting yourself. You risk fumbling the mute and dropping it. Here's what that sounds like. Do you want that in the middle of your piece? I don't. And it also means, even if everything goes well, it means I have to play with one hand, which is not ideal. So make sure we've got time. That's important. Okay. I think that's all the introductory material. Let's go mute by mute and do some demonstration. Really quick, let me play a few notes open just so you get an idea of the sound of the trumpet. You probably already know what it sounds like, but nonetheless, I'm going to try to cover fairly low and fairly high notes, and both playing smoothly and playing angularly. I'm making up all these examples, so forgive me if they're not perfect. The basic idea of the open trumpet. Okay. You've already heard a bit of this. This is a straight mute. This is kind of the ordinary, normal trumpet mute. In fact, trumpet players, when you see a part that just says mute and doesn't specify, usually this is probably what you want. Writers always tell us what kind of mute you want. There's no excuse for leaving that off. So, straight mute, generally speaking, is good for rhythmic playing. It gives sort of a distant, crisp sound to the trumpet. Let's try it out. So that's the sound. It's a neat sound, probably better for percussive playing than for lyrical playing. This is a Joe Rao straight mute. It's a great mute. You heard that it pretty easily plays high and low. Any straight mute will run your tuning a little sharp, but not too much. This is a good vanilla, middle-of-the-road straight mute. It'll do pretty much everything well. I'm going to show you a couple others. This is a Tom Crown mute. Normally it's copper. Mine is just dirty and old. Let's see how this one sounds. Yeah, it's a tighter, edgier, more aggressive sound. Sometimes you want that. Normally straight mutes aren't that great for lyric passages. This is a Trumcore lyric straight mute. It's specifically designed for it. In fact, it even says lyric on the side of it. Let's hear this. Pretty nice. It takes some of the edge off of the attack, so it's not quite as good for rhythmic things, but wonderful for flowing lines on a straight mute. Okay, one more quick demonstration. This is a stone-lined straight. I almost never use this thing. It's really not as much of a quality mute as the others, but every once in a while I'll do a jazz orchestra job where they want this sound for these jazz demonstrations. I'll get the B-flat trumpet. Let's try it out. So, it's not quite as aggressively muted as some of the others. And it's not a real easy mute to play on, but sometimes it's the authentic sound of an old dance band. Okay. The next major kind of mute to check out is the cup mute. This is used pretty often in all kinds of music. You see it in solos, you see it in the wind ensemble, occasionally in the orchestra, and pretty often in jazz groups. This kind, by the way, is a Dennis Wick adjustable cup. I'll show you the adjustable part in a moment. The cup mute has a lovely far away kind of muffled sound. So yeah, there's not a lot of front on the notes, but it's really lovely and flowing, and it cuts back the edge and the volume. It's a lot easier to blend with woodwinds if you're using a cup mute. The adjustable part of this mute, part of what makes it so neat, is I can actually slide the cup part closer into the bell, and it's going to sound rather different. So you get to control how muffled and muted you want it to be. Another cool trick with these is you can take a cloth or a Crown Royal bag and line the inside of it for a really lovely velvety sound. This is a wonderful mute. It's probably the most expensive of all these I've got. I think it costs like 65 bucks. It's kind of a lot, but it's a mute that plays very well in tune and is very easy to control. Cup mutes, by the way, trumpet players, tend to make you go flat. Most mutes make you go sharp. These actually tend to bring your pitch down a bit. There's another kind I want to demonstrate. This is a stone-lined cup, and normally it's white. Mine is just kind of old and dirty. Usually I prefer the Dennis Wick. It's really easy to control and tune. This, however, has a really distinctive sound. Pardon the switch. And it's really great for jazz orchestras. Take a listen. So that's that. You can probably hear in that demonstration, I had a little trouble with that low note and a little trouble with the tuning. It isn't quite as good a mute technically, but the sound is just right for big band playing. And it's a little bit louder and edgier than a classical cup mute would be. So this is really the authentic jazz cup mute sound. In fact, you can hear solos. People like Dizzy Gillespie love to use this thing. So good to have. Let's move on. This thing is called a Harmon mute. If you go to buy one of these trumpet players, Harmon is actually a brand name, so they can't call it that. But in the real world, we always call it a Harmon mute, no matter who manufactured it. This one, in fact, is Joe Rowell. I have to admit, I really like this one better than the Harmon brand, and most trumpet players, I think, would agree. It comes with this stem thing. You can play it with the stem or without. So writers, make sure you always tell us no stem or stem in. And you always want no stem. That's the classic Harmon sound. Only very rare exceptions will be made to that. Let's try it. By the way, playing the Harmon, it doesn't stick in the bell that well. I usually have to breathe like that, and then it'll stick better. So if possible, give us more time to get the Harmon in. All right, here we go. So it's a really neat sound, isn't it? It's totally different, extremely distinctive. Most people hear that and they think of Miles Davis, who loved to use the Harmon mute, though he certainly wasn't the only one. So really neat, really unique kind of sounding mute. However, be careful. This mute is very difficult to play on. It will screw up your high and low notes. In fact, let me try to play as low as I can in the Harmon mute. Okay, I got the notes to come out, but they sounded terrible and really not easy to play. It greatly reduces your volume. Too many big band writers will use this because it sounds cool without realizing how soft it makes the trumpet. If it sounded loud right now, that's probably because I adjusted by playing much louder. But playing with a big band when you're already playing very loud, you're just going to be drowned out if you're not careful in writing for it. It can be a great sound, but you got to be careful. If I'm up against 4 open trombones and 5 saxophones, it's not going to be heard. Now, what it works really well for is in the studio, where you can just turn it up if it's too soft, or for solos, where you can plant it right in the mic. So that's the Harmon. Trumpet players, these things really make it difficult to play. They tend to throw the tuning way sharp. So there are different schools of thought on this. My personal view, what's easiest for me is just stay open, use the air right, and remember that the notes are going to tend to ride high, and then it'll come out in tune. Some teachers, including my own teacher in college, prefer to actually move the tuning slide out a little bit when they use a Harmon mute. I find if I do that, I just play flat. So I don't do it. Experiment to see what works best for you and your equipment. This is a Joe Rowell Harmon mute. If you buy it from a catalog, they call it Bubble or Wow Wow mute. We all call it a Harmon mute. This is my favorite. It really plays well, all things considered. They also have a copper version, which sounds a bit different. That's neat too. I'll show you some other models though. This is a Humes and Berg Harmon mute. I kind of like this one. I don't like the sound as much, but it's easier to crank out low notes in it. Let's try that. So different sound. Again, don't care for it as much, but better control of some of the notes. You might prefer it. This is an actual Harmon brand Harmon mute. This is really the original authentic mute. There are trumpet players that would rather use this because it's the original design. I find them very difficult to play. All the problems that the Joe Rowell has, stem started to fall out on me. All the problems that the Joe Rowell has are way magnified on the Harmon brand. Let's try it. So yeah, I made it work. It's not too bad. And it is a slightly different sound. So you might decide you'd rather use this for authenticity. I think the Joe Rowell's a better mute. That's up to you. I do want to cover quickly playing with the stem in. Again, this is almost never what you want. I think I've only ever played 3 or 4 pieces that need the stem in, and all of them were modern classical works. They weren't jazz. Normally the Harmon is used in jazz and not as much in classical works, although newer solos do often make you use it. Here's the general sound of it. It's a really kind of corny, silly sound. You can also do this using your fingers. It's very corny, but it's kind of a wah-wah effect like a guitar might have. I've used this in classical music and pieces that make you do the wah effect very, very slowly for a strange kind of ethereal sound, but generally speaking, you don't use the stem. This isn't really a trumpet mute. It's a plunger. This is the cheapest of all these by far. I bought it for $1.50 at Home Depot. It's a sync plunger, and I just took off the handle. For trumpets, a sync plunger works better. Usually a toilet plunger will be too big, and it'll cover the bell too much. You'll notice this fits very nicely over the bell of a trumpet. Here's what you do with this thing. When you use the plunger, you actually have to play with one hand, which is important because it tends to be a little tougher to get your fingers moving when you're playing with one hand. And your other hand works the plunger over the bell. I should add that if you're a very small person, if you're very short or young, a beginner on the trumpet, say you're 10 or something and you're not full grown, this may be a difficult position to get into because of how long your left arm has to be. If you're a normal sized adult, don't worry, but thought I'd mention that. Now, here's how we do this. We will play with this thing closed. You'll notice when I say closed, can you see that? It's not actually totally closed, it's just mostly closed. And then open, where it's all the way off the bell. You're never going to clamp it totally shut, because then you won't get anything, but you can alternate between open and closed for some neat effects. You can even go from open to closed or closed to open on the same note. So when you write for the plunger, Make sure that you always tell the player what you want them to do with it. You can't just say plunger. You have to make sure you tell them, do you want it open or closed? So every note should have either an O for open or a plus for closed. If you want them to open or close during a note, then you'll write, for example, O dash plus. In other words, start the note open and then close as you hold it. A note needs to be a certain length to do that. If I have a note that goes this long, I can't really open or close during that note, can I? Yeah, you don't really get the effect. It has to be a little bit longer to get the wah effect. So that's what you use a plunger for. Some trumpet players actually like to drill a hole through the middle to let a little more air through. I've never found that necessary, but you might want to. This effect, by the way, is pretty much only used in jazz groups. A lot of old dance band music has it. I'm sure there are classical pieces that use it, but they are few and far between. I should add, a lot of trumpet players get really good at taking solos with the plunger. If you add growling and flutter tonguing, you can get some cool effects. I'm not an expert at that, but that's never stopped me before, so. Not the world's greatest solo, but you got a sense of the kind of cool talking effects you can do with a plunger and growling. By the way, for the growling effect, I'm humming and playing at the same time. You might be able to hear the humming since I'm so close to the mic, but in a performance situation, you wouldn't hear that. You just hear the growl. So that's the plunger. I actually own this thing. This is a Humes and Berg plunger. It's actually designed for the purpose of being a trumpet plunger. I can't really recommend these because a normal plunger does the job and it's much cheaper. But if you want to try it, the sound isn't quite the same. It works. It's nice. But I'd kind of rather use a normal plunger. I was in a band for a while that was sponsored by Humes and Berg, so I've got a bunch of their mutes. Now, those four mutes, the straight, the cup, the Harmon, and the plunger, are the most commonly used. The first three for classical ensembles and the last three for jazz ensembles where you don't use the straight all that much. So you can expect trumpet players to have those in their mute bag. Let's check out a few more unusual ones. This is a bucket mute. This one's made by Humes and Berg, and it's actually called for in jazz sometimes. It goes on the trumpet in a funny way. You have to get these legs around the bell. Give me a moment to do that. There we go. It takes a second to do, so don't forget your player's going to need some time to get it on there. But you'll notice it doesn't go in the bell. It just sits in front of it. This is just a little bucket full of some kind of cotton-like material that will make the sound gentler and velvety. So the cool thing about the bucket is because it doesn't actually go in the bell, it doesn't affect your technique at all. It won't throw off your high notes or low notes or response. It just gives it a different sound. A lot of times you see bands just point the trumpet in the stand instead of bothering with these, and that is a lot easier than carrying this heavy thing and getting it on and off the bell, but it's not quite the same sound. This is a variation on the bucket mute. I don't know if you can see, but it's got cotton stuff crammed in it as well. But unlike that bucket mute that I just showed you, it just goes in the bell like a normal mute. It's not quite the same sound. It tends to be to me, it sounds like a cross between a cup and a bucket mute. It's not quite as lovely and clear as the normal bucket, but it's a lot easier to deal with. So that's a thought. All right, I have two more to demonstrate. This little bitty thing is called a pixie mute. It really is just a kind of straight mute, but because it's kind of small, you can get it into your bell and then use a plunger over it. That's usually what the pixie mute seems to be for. I'm really not good at demonstrating the pixie and the plunger, but I'll try it anyways. So it's a little tough with all that stuff in the way of the bell. And again, this isn't something I have much experience with, but that's what it's for. One more. This thing is called a solo tone mute, and it's not as commonly used, but I had to buy it for a gig a few years ago, so I might as well demonstrate it. This is made by Humes & Berg, this particular one. It's a funny looking deal, and the entire purpose of the solo tone mute is it makes the trumpet sound like it does on those old Victrola records. Gives it that kind of funny, scratchy sound. Let's try it. Pretty cool. It's a neat sound. It is a difficult mute to play. It'll throw off your technique and tuning a good bit. But you will occasionally see this seems like where I've seen it the most is in musicals, but that is the solo tone mute. And that pretty much exhausts my collection. So I hope trumpet players and writers both that this little tutorial has helped you out. Thanks for watching. See you later.